Our keynote speaker, Mr. Adam Snyder, Global Digital and Social Media Strategist at Burson Marsteller, is here to discuss the results of the latest Twiplomacy study, an annual survey that examines how international organizations and world leaders use social media. He will also give us some insights into the role in social media played at the World Economic Forum just last week in Davos. It is now my privilege to introduce Mr. Adam Snyder from Burson Marsteller, who will get us started by presenting the latest Twiplomacy report, as well as his insights from Davos. Thank you again for being with us, and I wish you all a fruitful digital discussion and a very successful day at the United Nations. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me. I'm here today to talk about a study called Twiplomacy, and Twiplomacy really looks at diplomacy in the digital age and really gets into detail on how it's playing out over Twitter. Before I get started, you'll notice that the first name on there is @Lufkins, as far as the individual. That's my colleague, Matthias Lufkins, who I believe many in this room actually know. This is his brainchild. This is really his baby, something that he has built from scratch and really developed. Now, he's done all the work, and I get the pleasure of presenting here at the UN, but if you're really interested in learning more, I would say follow Matthias on Twitter. He is actually a social media ninja, as we would call. We were just in Davos together, and he was called Mr. Selfie, Mr. Social Media, Der Konig to social media, and all sorts of other things by a number of delegates that we saw on the street. So when we start, I always like to just give a baseline of what we're talking about with social media. And the real way to look at it is that it is media that is social. I mean, it truly gives a level playing field, and I think much more in the democratic sense than in the conversational sense. I, as an individual, started on Twitter in 2007, and I was technically an early adopter. In about a week, I had 100 followers. About 3 years later, I spoke at a conference. I got up to 1,000 followers. Now, somehow, I have about 5,000, even though I don't really think I have anything interesting to say. But the point is I started right when a number of other sort of very influential individuals started. And going from 0 to 5,000 shows that just me with no backing, no company, no government, nothing behind me, I'm actually able to get out there and get my voice. And so social really is, I would say, something that in the sort of growing socialized world is something that's truly a great equalizer. And why does this matter? We always like to break this down really into two ways. You know, it's a two-sided coin. First and foremost, it gives you as an individual, as an organization, as a leader, as a company, real-time access to the masses. And if you want to reach an audience, you know, like we're using today, #UNSocial, anyone who is following that will see a tweet that someone sends. Now, if you take a step back and you think about it, there are thousands of people following this around the world. You essentially have the opportunity to reach thousands of eyeballs with a message, with a comment, with something that you're trying to put out. You know, that is, I think, one of the sort of small indicators of why we see that the online world is sort of turning the TV advertising world on its head. If you can actually go out as a brand or as a company or as an organization and put out a message and have thousands of people see it for free, well, why do you need to pay $1 million for a spot during match day or during the Super Bowl or during something else? There's a lot of other ways now that, again, truly baseline and social that we can really look at. But the second point, and it's definitely a caution, is it's also the new public record. So what you say online is not going anywhere. The example that I like to give, it's very American, but I think it'll really prove the point. A football team, American football team out of New England, reached 1 million Twitter followers a few months back. And so as a thank you, they decided to randomly select one of their 1 million followers, or I think it was every 10,000, and create an image and create a New England Patriots jersey with that person's Twitter name on the back and say thank you. Now, the issue is there was no human moderation, and as smart as machines are, they're sort of not very smart. They didn't really look at who they were doing this thank you for. So their 10,000 fan happened to be a Twitter handle with a very racist and expletive-filled name. And now, as a New York Jets fan, it's great to see the Patriots suffer. But so they put out this thing of @expletive derogatory comment, thank you for being a fan. Now, after the fact, they happened to see this and they immediately deleted it, and I think it was about 3 minutes. But within those 3 minutes, I think it was up on 1,000 different blogs that had been posted to ESPN, the New York Times, everyone under the sun saying the New England Patriots support racism. And, you know, they're probably going to win on Sunday, but it was good that they got a little pushback. So caution is that if you put it out there, it's not going anywhere. And so if we look now, going back to this notion of it being the great equalizer, I had a video. Unfortunately, the technology didn't work, but it actually is better because we're talking about the age before technology. If everyone's familiar with the TV show Downton Abbey, it takes place sort of right after World War I in a British aristocratic family, sort of right as old Europe was changing into new Europe. And in 1924, and this is historically accurate, the king decided to address the public over wireless radio. And this made the Earl and his butler and the whole family so uncomfortable. It was, people are going to hear the king's voice, and they're going to realize that the king is a real person, and he's going to relate to them just like that. Like, what's going on here? And it was this real sort of tragic, horrible thing. And finally, the Earl says, if the king is going to have to do this, we're going to have to buy a radio, and we're going to have to support him. And yes, he's going to talk to his people about the empire, but everything is going to be okay. And so if we think about that in 1924, there was this issue with people hearing the king's voice, as we start to look at how social media has impacted sort of the regal area, it's pretty interesting. So we'll just take a quick look at sort of who is, from a royal standpoint, who's using Twitter. So one of the most, if we could go 2 slides up. Next. We see, and this would make the butler on Downton Abbey stir, that we're finding a lot of royals using Twitter to show that they're human. Prince Haakon from Norway is an excellent, prolific Twitter user, and in a lot of ways, in the positive Machiavellian sense, he's using Twitter to show that he's a representative of Norway. So you see things that his family is doing. You see charity work that they're doing. You see in this example, his family, just like a real family, is out there on vacation enjoying themselves. And it's just interesting to see, you know, if you think about 1924, that now we have the crown prince and future king really out there showing himself. Another example is we'll see the Prince of Monaco actually out there announcing that the lineage has been continued on Twitter. And rather than put out a press release or go on TV, the first instance was here. And again, just very interesting to see from a small principality that you're seeing the prince out there. If you also follow what the prince does, you'll see images of him at Nelson Mandela's funeral, of him doing charity work, of him sitting in things the EU Commission. And again, really showing what his commitment is to the principality and to greater Europe. We've also seen royals taking part in something that the general public is doing. Now, months back, one individual wanted to get attention for ALS, which is a very, very horrible disease, and pointed out that having ALS is like having a bucket of ice water dumped over your head. And I'm sure a number of people in the room saw the ice bucket challenge, probably participated. Well, we saw the King of Belgium do this, and actually dump the bucket over his head and participate, and then go on to challenge people. Now, again, if we think, you know, the Royal of Belgium is now going down and doing what the common folk are doing, again, you're seeing just how in social media it's impacting from the bottom up and really sort of giving us this just, you know, very sort of basic touch point. What we also saw, going back to the Prince of Monaco, is he participated, and then he challenged Francois Hollande and Prince Haakon to also participate. Now, what's interesting here is I remember reading an article about when Grace Kelly married Prince Rainier and became the Princess of Monaco. The people of Monaco demanded that she stop acting because the last thing that they would want is to see their princess in a movie. So if you just think in what, 1960 till now, that the princess could not take part in a movie, but the prince can actually dump ice water over his head just like everyone else. It's again, we're seeing how social in the world is really impacting things. We're also seeing new generations announced, and this is coming in countries where there isn't as much freedom of speech as Western Europe or as the US or some other areas, where the new king of Saudi Arabia has actually sent, I think as of now, 10 tweets and is a regular Twitter user. So he announced that he was coming on and he was becoming king. So again, further just seeing how this is impacting what's happening and really how we're seeing changes to the landscape due to Twitter. We also saw the former king of Spain abdicate over Twitter. And what's very interesting about this is, one, this is sort of an older royal. Even though he didn't come into power until the late 70s, he's definitely more from the old line. It was also Twitter that really helped push to force him to advocate. I mean, there were a number of pictures of him hunting in Africa that got animal rights groups and activists and everything else really up in arms. And I think there was something, the picture of him shooting an elephant was retweeted hundreds of thousands of times. So you saw not only did Twitter and the sort of social baseline, even playing field push this, but what you also saw was the king then abdicating over this. And again, this then pushed, and there was a press release after the fact, but this was the first message. We're also seeing royals using Twitter to take a stand on important messages. Now, I made the point about a hashtag, and that's a way to reach anyone who is talking about some sort of topic and a way to align to a conversation. Well, Queen Rayner of Jordan is very outspoken. She's definitely an activist and really stands out and makes messages. She uses Twitter to really let it be known that she has a stance on important issues and she wants to rally people behind those. We're also seeing the pontiff, the Pope, out there on Twitter. He has 9 separate language accounts, and we'll get into, I think it's about 10 million followers as of now. He's regularly doing things to rally his followers. You know, he's outspoken in the media, he's very outspoken in social media, and is definitely out there with, talking about it's very important for human rights. It's very important that Christianity takes a stand and really has important issues. And it's fascinating to follow him. I would say, out of all of the royals that we looked at, he's probably one of the most prolific Twitter users. We mentioned the World Economic Forum. Last year's World Economic Forum, he put out a message all about wealth and equality, and it was resonating, not just on Twitter, but then in the real world. As you were walking around Davos, you couldn't step into a bar or a cafe without hearing people say, "Did you see the Pope's message?" So again, a perfect example of how to reach people. Now, much to the dismay of the butler in Downton Abbey, we're also seeing the royal family of Europe start tweeting. When the Invictus Games came to the UK, Prince Harry sent his first tweet on behalf of them, and this was actually the tweet announcing it, and so it was just amazing. As you can see, he's so excited by the technology. This takes me back. Seeing this tweet as we were doing the research, we look back about 5 years, there was a video of him and his brother showing the Queen the new website for the royal house. And it was, "Oh, Granny, take a look," and Bubba was really going through the technology, and so now you see it a step further that he's tweeting. And now just to put the last one, if you could click one more time. Even the Queen is tweeting. Now again, does not have her own Twitter handle, but at the opening of the Science Museum, she sent the inaugural tweet. And so now we're seeing royals actually coming out and cutting digital ribbons. So again, Twitter has very much created this even playing field and in a lot of ways brought these institutions that were so sort of high up and above us down to planet Earth. So let's dive into diplomacy now. And diplomacy is a study, as we mentioned, it really looks at what is the digital diplomacy landscape. How are governments, heads of state, finance ministers, NGOs, international organizations, how are they using Twitter to conduct digital diplomacy? And what we really look at in this study is it's not just how many followers you have, because that is such a simple baseline, almost in a lot of ways irrelevant metric. It's so much more about how people are using it, who's following them, and who's connecting with them. So we'll actually go in and we'll look at some details, and there will be time for the end on questions as we go through the study. So Twiplomacy, it's a 929-page study available on twiplomacy.com. I would say, as we point out here, please consider the environment before printing. But we're looking at a number of different topics, a number of different areas, all sorts of things that I think, speaking to a group at the UN, you can really find that can impact your jobs and give you just a great sort of hip pocket piece of information to draw from as conversations are happening. And the basic piece of what we found is Twitter is a formidable communications tool. Over the past 5 years, it's gone from being something that very few people in government or in statecraft were using to something that nearly every one of them are using. What we're also finding is beyond just the point I was making about hashtags, it's truly giving people accessibility to their leadership. And we'll see some examples of some very good people in Africa and in Sweden who are doing this. But anyone can @message anyone. You don't have to be following it or be anything else. And so when I say @message, I can say @UN for my Twitter handle. I am so pleased to be speaking at the first social media day. And the people managing the UN Twitter handle will actually get a ping and see that. Now, whether or not they choose to respond is a whole other point, but it takes activism and it takes actually communicating with your government to an entirely new level. So what are we seeing? 84% of governments have a Twitter presence. We're seeing 130 heads of state and our governments are on Twitter. We're seeing 93 foreign ministries and 67 foreign ministers, and this is as of December 2014, are on Twitter. It's interesting. And if we look at how they connect and who the best connected are, first and foremost is the foreign minister of France. He has 99 of his peers following him, which means he will see their tweets, but more importantly, he can communicate with them privately. The European External Action Network comes in second, followed by the Russian Foreign Ministry, followed by the official French foreign ministry, and then after that, the Swedish foreign ministry. So when we look at this, if you look at just the declining numbers, 99, 82, 79, 74, 69, these are people who can be in direct contact. You know, there's the old-fashioned idea of diplomacy, and I'm sure it still exists, of having a hotline between one country and another. Well, now there's a Twitter line between one country and another, and you're seeing it play out in this case. If we look at the most followed world leaders, and these numbers from December 2014, you know, a month and a half later, are actually out of date. Number one is Barack Obama. The second, and this is a combination of all of the Pope's 9 language accounts, is the Pope. Third is the Indian Prime Minister. The fourth is the Turkish Prime Minister. And then the fifth is the White House. Now, again, we mentioned that this is just purely followers. This does not mean that they're the most influential, nor they're the most engaged. This just means that they have this broad reach. Now, when we talk about advertising and public relations, sort of the initial metric that any success is actually measured on is impressions. And it's slowly but surely fading away with importance, because impressions just means the number of people you could have possibly reached or who could have possibly seen it. Whereas, so 49 million people are following Barack Obama. That doesn't mean that 49 million people are seeing every one of his tweets. It means 49 million people could have. Now, the average life cycle of a tweet is 2 minutes. So in reality, let's say 50,000 people at best are probably seeing each one of his tweets. But there are ways to curate, and we'll get to that in a little bit. If we look at the most active world leaders, we're actually seeing this come out of Central and South America, the different groups. So the government of Mexico are actually going, and all of these are going on borderline spamming, sends 78 tweets per day, followed by the presidency of Mexico sending another 78 tweets. So just in case you didn't see it once, you'll see it again. Then El Salvador and Dominican Republic and the presidency of Colombia are all close, you know, second, third, fourth, and fifth. And these are also sending messages about policy, about things that are taking place in the country, about events, about different things that will actually be happening. And so you're really seeing these very, very, very active handles. Now, me as the professional who would be advising individuals in this room, I wouldn't necessarily say to tweet 78 times per day, but there is a lot to see and a lot of different ideas and a lot of different seeds that can get planted based on seeing what these individuals are tweeting. So I would recommend taking a look at these accounts. If we look at the most conversational world leaders, now this gets back to that point of @messages, and the president of Rwanda is a great example. Something to the effect of 87% of his tweets are replies to people who have actually messaged him. And it's, if you look at his feed, and there's a few others, it almost reads like an old-fashioned message board. It's not just, I am doing this, #event. It's, I'm going to be in this place, please tell me what you think, people of Rwanda. And then the people will actually give him quotes. Okay, well, Mr. President, we would love to see you do X, Y, Z, A, B, and C. And then you actually see he goes back and responds to all of them. Same with the president of Ecuador and the prime minister of Norway. Very, very, very conversational with their people. We're also seeing the foreign ministry of Rwanda and the foreign minister of Kuwait doing something similar. A little bit less conversational, but very, very engaged and very active with their followings. Now, if we look at this as far as tweeting, you know, who's been online and which groups have been using Twitter. Now, the joke that I always make when I talk about this is this follows Twitter's stock price. But in reality, when you look at this graph, this really follows how Twitter was adopted internationally, which is why in 2007, you had Barack Obama, you had the Prime Minister of Canada, you had the State Department, very, very, very Western-focused places using Twitter first, because that's who was using Twitter in 2007. 2008, 2009, 2010, you know, leading till now, it definitely got much more internationally adopted, and now you're seeing many, many more heads of state, foreign ministries, organizations, you know, really using it to the point where we're up to number of 184 actually on it. And that's, as you know, Twitter has gone from being this very, very Western-focused tool to something that is just as international as it gets when it comes to truly social media. And if we combine this, now again, this was as of December 2014, so we're probably at 2.3 million. But from 2007 till now, there have been 2.2 million tweets sent by world leaders to 175 million followers. Now again, taking a step back, thinking about, you know, the crew in Downton Abbey who were so worried that people were going to hear the king, their heads would spin. And, you know, with the expression of rolling over in their grave, I think they would probably make the grave 20 feet deep by how much they would spin if they saw this, knowing that this many messages have been sent directly to the constituencies and people to 175 million followers around the world. And so we have a lot of data, as you can see. There's a lot of information. We have a fantastic tool on Twiplomacy.com that's built by this great company called Surely out of Luzerne. And what it does is really let you go in and manipulate and touch and feel and play with the data. So if you want to know about how foreign ministers in Western Europe are using it, you can do that. If you want to see how finance ministers in the Middle East are using that, you can do that. If you want to see prime ministers in Africa and see what their data is, you can do that. There is a fascinating amount of information. And now I've been working Twiplomacy and working on this for a year, and I probably haven't even scratched the surface on this. And as a true data geek, it's fascinating really to see what we have here. So when we think about Twiplomacy and what we've learned, it's really fun to look at different tips and different pieces of information that are out there that we can use actually to advise and learn from. So we're just going to go through a few of these. So first and foremost, a tweet is like a newspaper headline. If it's well written, your followers will want to click on the link and read more. And there's a lot of very prolific users here and a lot of just great headlines. So when the now current Prime Minister of India won, what did he first do? India has won. He made it all about the people. And this has actually been the most retweeted and favorited tweet in India, period, ever. Another great example is the Prime Minister of Romania. Now, he's not a very active Twitter user. In fact, he stopped using it around 2012 after he won re-election. But one thing that we saw in looking at this information and wanted to try and put it, I personally think, I'm best when I'm being self-deprecating because, what's funnier to laugh at than myself. But this individual was very, very good at just sort of, having some humor and putting some personality into his tweets. And this was the last tweet that he sent before he got elected president. And there we go, he's saying, look, if I was the captain, it would not have sunk. And I think that's a great message to say, now you have your captain to steer the ship of Romania. I would say not listed here, a prolific Twitter user, somebody who I use as an example when talking to executives, is Helen Clark from the UNDP. She is just fantastic at putting in her work, her personal life, her travels, and really giving you this diary and access to what she's doing day to day. So I don't know if Christine is here from the UNDP, but congratulations. Helen is just an absolutely fantastic Twitter user and somebody who I think, anyone who really wants to learn about Twitter, she's sort of the archetype you can learn from. So the next question is, when you're putting together a tweet, you should always ask yourself, is it interesting? Is it relevant? Is it engaging? Is it something that people are actually going to care about? And so there's a few different ways to go about that. A very popular tweet that the White House sent was in the wake of a crisis that we're still dealing with, was Ebola. And there was all of this misinformation online of, well, if I walk near somebody who had Ebola, then I'm going to spread it to my entire family. And had a lot of hysteria in the news, a lot of hysteria in the American news, which I apologize for, really speaking about this. And the White House really taking a stance in a position of leadership, went on their Twitter handle, and this is just one of many, to really call out the fact, this is what Ebola is. These are the facts, believe us, here's all of the information. And so again, this was very engaging, and the key here is it was connective because it was relevant, it was timely, and it was about an important issue. Another one is just to come clean. Now, the CIA, and I'm not trying to only use American examples, but the CIA did a great one, and this is much to the dismay of several conspiracy theorists out there, said, in the 1950s, do you remember those reports of a UFO flying over New Mexico? Well, sorry, that was us. So I don't know if that means Hollywood has to give back all the money and all the different UFO movies they've made, or if Independence Day is now not going to be the biggest box office movie ever, but it's very interesting to see this organization that is built on secrecy really coming clean about an issue that has been debated and talked about. Now, the other question that I always have with reading this, in 10 years from now, are they going to take this back when the aliens have a Twitter handle and say, well, actually, we'll see. Right now, it's just global. It hasn't gone intergalactic yet. Then there's also the idea of being connective and being timely and being relevant. Now, not to have a shameless plug, which I'm happy to do, but at the World Economic Forum, we saw the finance minister of Turkey actually tweeting out information about Twiplomacy. Now, my colleague Matthias, who I mentioned, was actually putting together day-to-day updates while we were in Davos of this is how this world leader is connecting, this is how that world leader is connecting, these groups, and just even further drilling down into the data at a point when you're at this major, major international, diplomatic, financial event. Now, we always get this question of, is there a best time to tweet? And especially as it was there a best time to tweet that we saw in looking at Twiplomacy. Now, unfortunately for me, since I work with teams in the US, but then in London and in Hong Kong, the world is not on one time zone. And so sometimes I don't know if it's up or down or day or night. But the reality is as we've done this study, there is no best time to tweet. What we can say is, and this will be a vague answer, there might be a best time to tweet based on who your followers are, where they are, what they're interested in, what they're following. I think it's more so the way to look at it is the best time to tweet is when something is timely. Now, a good tweet doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get picked up and it's going to get read, but if we look back at that idea of it being on the public record and it being out there, you're able to push something out timely. You can show in the past, well, I was on this issue, I was following this topic, I was at this event. So really, again, the best time to tweet is timely, and it's when you feel comfortable tweeting. Now, we're also seeing that there's this great way with Twitter we mentioned about connecting with people. And we've been trying to interview a lot of different individuals and get some quotes and comments and actually take Twiplomacy from just being something that we're putting out to something that individuals who are reporting on actually have a piece of. So this is an example of my colleague actually reaching out to Radek Sikorsky to try and get him to respond. And if we click again, once more, why not do it in his language as well? And again, this is just that idea of the real level playing field and the idea that we have direct access to our leaders. So this individual is not following us. We wanted to speak with him. Why not message him and try and get him to actually respond? We also saw, and this is one of my favorite examples, when the Organization for Chemical Weapons Proliferation won the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Org could not reach them on the phone and they could not reach them via email. So they turned to Twitter, and they finally did reach them. If you saw this tweet was retweeted and favorited, and it actually drove real news. And this is just a great example of, again, this just real level playing field and this real sort of close access that we have via Twitter. Now again, direct messages are a very interesting thing, and we talked about the idea of a hotline. So the Prime Minister of India is actually following Twiplomacy, so we are able to direct message him and say, look, we're doing this study, we would like your information, we'd love for you to take part. And what we see is that he says, great, email us back. We've also seen this case with Carl Bildt from Sweden as well, who is just very out there and very much somebody who's on Twitter again. So we've responded to him, we've @messaged him, we've direct messaged him, and finally responds, I would love to see an advanced copy of the study. So again, now going back to some of these tips. Following someone, as I mentioned, does not necessarily mean that you read all their tweets, which is again why we talk about that follower number is not the most relevant topic. So if you want to do so, the best way to really see someone's tweets and make sure they have a full list is to create a Twitter list. So what we found is, go to the next one. With all of this data that we have all these different individuals, all these people that we can follow. So go to the next one. We've created a number of public lists that you can find on the Twiplomacy Twitter handle that are broken out by all these different groups. As I mentioned, all the people who you have access to via that data, we've then taken and summarized, because not everybody is into getting hands-on with the data, and said, if you want to follow these heads of state, follow them here. If you want to follow this world leader, follow them here. And again, you can see the number of members that we have broken out. Next one. And one more. Then we also have our own private Twitter lists, and we get back to that notion of direct messaging. These are things that are our own that we can use, that we're actually able to send out blasts and send 10 messages at a time to these individuals about advanced copies of the study, to question them on findings, and really just to get more information so we can improve this better. And interesting, one finding that we have is Carl Bildt is the best connected world leader, even though he's technically not in government anymore. Was listed as the best technical, and again, if you look at this, he has this bit of self-deprecation. Sounds interesting, and he gives us a plug. And one piece I'd say, so one reason why he's the best connected, and again, he's another one, I say behind Helen Clark, is probably the second most prolific Twitter user that we've found. He spends a ton of time, now this is granted, this is about 6 months old before he's out of office. He spends a lot of time actually responding, and not just saying, great, thank you for your message, but engaging with conversation, with people in conversation on his Twitter handle. And so he's one really to look at, I would say. Another is the Prime Minister of Uganda. And again, he uses Twitter, again, more as a message board, more as a conversational tool to keep his constituents up, up to date on what he's doing, where he is, who he's speaking with, and again, just really using the channel to show that he's not up here, that he's really on planet Earth with people, and that he is a representative of the people. So a great point to take away is really tweet directly and speak with these people. Another fantastic, fantastic Twitter user is the current president of Estonia. We actually had the pleasure of interviewing him in Davos, and unfortunately the technology for video is not working now, but we spoke with him and we did a 6-second Vine video. Now Vine is the Twitter of video. It's, if Twitter is 140 characters, Vine is 6 seconds, so you can get out a sentence at most. And so when we spoke with him, he actually gave us a quick quote to say that the World Economic Forum is like Twitter in real life. And it's just amazing. Speaking with a world leader who's that prolific on Twitter, he has the stage at the World Economic Forum. Let's talk about Twitter. And I could certainly send around a video. We can try and click the next slide. The video may play. I will send a tweet later on the hashtag with a link to this video so everyone can see. Now, another great way to really use Twitter is to document what you're doing. And so here we saw this individual meeting with the Prime Minister of Holland in the, at the World Economic Forum. And really just pointing it out, this is the Prime Minister of Indonesia speaking with the Prime Minister of Holland, showing this. This lets his people and his followers know what he's doing at the World Economic Forum, shows that he's meeting with this other world leader, and really lets progress get documented. And this, again, this is a simple @ message. So essentially, everyone who follows the Prime Minister of Holland also saw this, and this was likely retweeted as well. Now again, we talk about this notion, the number of followers is really irrelevant. It's all about quality. I would much rather have a Twitter handle that has 500 of the people I want to reach than 50,000 of the people that I don't want to reach. It's all about that sort of internal bit and those real quality people, the influential folks and those important people that you want to reach. And so if we look at the handles that are followed by the most world leaders, I would say congratulations to Charlotte and Nancy. The United Nations Twitter handle is followed by the most world leaders, which means they can send direct messages to the most world leaders, foreign ministries, foreign ministers, and other individuals. And if you look down, Barack Obama, likely because he's been on Twitter the longest, the White House, the State Department, all the way through. And towards the bottom, you start seeing journalists coming up as far as most followed by world leaders, which is interesting. It's not actually, sorry, not journalists, but actual media outlets. If we look at it again by influence, and we're talking, this is strictly media outlets, we don't start seeing the individual journalists. We see Christine Amanpour all the way towards the bottom, but the New York Times is followed by 142 Twiplomats, Reuters, CNN Breaking News, The Economist, BBC World, and then all the way down you see Christine. Now, the one point I want to leave with before we get into some Q&A is I did mention in the beginning that you're on sort of the public record, and something that you tweet is out there. But in the end, it's 140 characters. It lasts about 2 minutes, so don't make a crisis. The point that I was leaving is there was a presidential candidate in the US who, it was something like in order for him to send one tweet, and I think he sent 10 tweets during his campaign, it took 5 hours of review to make sure that the language was perfect for 140 characters. Or in my professional life, I do a lot of work with a large bank, and banks would be nothing without lawyers. I mean, that they make the sun, the moon, and the stars hide and disappear. If we want to send a tweet about something, there has to be 10 lawyers reviewing it, approving it, making sure. But in the end, it's a tweet. It's a great way to communicate, and it's something that lets you be connected to different groups. So please, as I mentioned, thank you very much for having me. Follow me on Twitter, follow Burson Marsteller on Twitter, follow Twiplomacy, and follow Matthias Lufkins. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
Thank you for that interesting overview. My name is Gary Fowley. I'm the representative for the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, which is a UN specialized agency. I was really interested to see that President Kagame is the most conversational, and I think a little background that you might find interesting is, and explain that, is he is actually the chair of our UN commission on Broadband Commission for Digital Development, which is structured to bring attention to the need to roll out broadband, because social media has obviously had an incredible impact on all of our lives, but for 70% of the world who doesn't have access to the internet and the broadband technology that really is the lifeblood for social media, it's of limited value at this point. So to have someone like President Kagame push that is incredibly important for ensuring that everybody does have access. So I think we have to keep that in mind. And you know, what are your thoughts on how we might actually connect the rest of the world, 70% of the world who does not have access to this kind of social media? Yes, they have a cell phone, but the platforms that they have aren't you know, compatible with the kind of data that you need to have to be able to use social media.
Sure. I mean, if you just think about the democratic nature of social media, I mean, that's probably the best place to take the issues to and really push that out to the people that you're trying to reach. You know, we talk about @messages, direct messages, and all of these other tools. You can reach people via those. And what you can also do is just, I'm sure the ITU has a pretty large Twitter following, you know, take to that and do some activist work and really push the issues out. What we find a lot of cases is that we see, and we mentioned, you know, with the abdication of the King of Spain, but I mean, you can see this in the corporate world, and you can see this, you know, really in many worlds, is you'll see real sort of live news media born out of what's happening in social media. You know, if you look, for example, The Guardian, almost every single article has built-in tweets for people to send out because they want to know, are people reading this, are people consuming this, and is this an important issue to follow? And so I would say, you know, find ways to get attention to that. There's also ways to put some money behind some of your content to get in front of the right people, and you can do that publicly and privately. And so it's, my thought is, you know, really take to the Twitter airwaves to get attention to the cause.
Kristen from the Millennium Campaign. I wanted to ask, because you mentioned that one key component, I guess, of leaders following each other is that they can private message each other. Is there any evidence of them actually doing that and communicating via Twitter privately?
It's more assumptive evidence, and main reason why is it wouldn't be private if I could tell you in a study, but I mean, the assumption is yes, especially some of the more prolific Twitter users, they're using every other feature publicly. I can't see why they wouldn't be using that one private feature in their own, you know, sort of behind closed doors.
Has anyone ever told you that they maybe communicated privately?
What we have seen are world leaders that we're following communicating privately with us, and we showed a few examples. So, you know, some of the more prolific ones that we're able to access a little bit more closely are using it. But that's something I could take away and also tweet about later.
Hi, I'm sorry. It's great. I'm Olivier Presch from the World Bank. If you, on all these leaders, how many of them are really tweeting by themselves, and how many have a team tweeting and responding and DM to you? So do you have an idea of that?
I don't have the stat off the top of my head, but we did actually track that, and we do have some indication of who's tweeting on their own and who's not. You know, Carl Bildt, as I mentioned, is tweeting on his own. Helen Clark tweets on her own. There are a lot who are doing it on their own, and then there's a lot who, you know, you can tell it's coming out of the press office. And I think the way, just sort of at a qualitative level, to look at that is, you can see this sort of bit of humanity in the tweets versus, you know, not to knock people in communications, which are myself. When something's a prepared statement, you know, it looks like a prepared statement. Now, one is not better than the other. You know, it really all depends on the purpose that you're trying to serve. But there's definitely a line that you can see. Yes.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for a great presentation. I'm Heidi Coots from the Canadian Consulate General. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit. You had a slide up there on news agencies and coverage and followers. And I was wondering if you could comment on how Twitter has influenced or impacted the coverage of foreign affairs and diplomacy by international news agencies.
Well, I think it's in general, Twitter has impacted news, period. You know, people's sort of cognitive appetite has gotten smaller. So people are now, you know, reading things in very, very small bits. I mentioned the point about The Guardian, but it's also the LA Times, I think it's also Der Spiegel, a number of other, you know, really large outlets. BBC does this, where they have pre-prepared tweets for you. So you read the article, here's what is called a share line in order to push that out. I think you're seeing that piece as far as how people are consuming it. It's also a measure of consumption. I think it's 99.9% of news outlets, whether it's a broadcast or if it's a print or if it's online, have buttons to say, share this on your different networks on the bottom. And that's changing the public relations industry and the news industry as a whole, because you now have an indication of, okay, this many people read it, this many people consumed it, they shared it, then this is what happened from there. And so you're seeing that. And then the other piece is the way that news is breaking has shifted significantly. I was speaking with a journalist in Davos last week, and he was talking about the days when they shot news on film. So they would actually do the nightly news, develop it, push it out, and it was amazing. We could get it out in an hour and a half. I mean, an hour and a half is gone and over. It's no longer breaking. So now you're seeing, journalists themselves are taking to Twitter, and they're at something like the World Economic Forum, or they're at something like, the UN Climate Summit, and something happens, some issue, something comes out, they're able to tweet it right out to their followers, and what that says is, okay, I'm going to write 1,000 words later, but no, here's 140 characters on what's taking place. Now, we have one over here. Oh, and we have a question from Twitter. How can you attract new audiences via Twitter? The big piece which we mentioned is, I talked about all those different tips. Be interesting, be engaging, be personal. But I think the other piece is if you really want to attract new audiences, it's all about being relevant, and that point we made about being timely. Hashtag gives you access to however many eyeballs that are following a certain event. So if you wanted to be known, the person who asked this question, about social media and international diplomacy, I would say tweet your opinions today on the UN social hashtag so that people can actually see, okay, here's my thoughts. I'm an authority on this topic. If you have a blog, tweet out links to that blog. If you're writing something in real time, find ways to get that. The hashtag is, if we talk about Twitter being this great equalizer, the hashtag is sort of the true baseline equalizer.
I was just wondering, you had said, be wary of trying to attract followers just for the sake of attracting followers, but would you advocate for, if you had some really great content that you thought a lot of people would really like that was outside what you normally publish, would you go for a campaign, for example? Would you pay for a campaign?
I mean, it really all depends on the content. You certainly can, and as I was mentioning to the gentleman from the ITU, if you're trying to get broad attention to an issue, absolutely. If you're, trying to sort of be more known internationally or be more widely known, then absolutely. But if, your goal is to tweet on something very, very, very specific, and there's a small universe of people that are actually, engaged on that topic, you don't need the ancillary 90,000 followers on top of that if that universe is 5,000, is the point there. Oh, yes.
You mentioned that there is no best time to tweet, but there are some providers that are also being used by reputable news organizations that guarantee maximum exposure to a specific tweet. So what do you make of these providers, and do they use tools that agree with what you just said, or is there anything else behind that?
Well, the point about the no best time to tweet that I was talking to specifically is that we did not find in the study that for a Twiplomat that there is a best time to tweet, that it's really all about what's the best for your followers, what's the best for your issue, what's the best for everything else. I'm weary of services that talk about sort of this, we're going to pinpoint you at the exact right time and get this out, and we're going to automate this and do that service, because the reality is you're dealing with human interaction. Human interactions are not perfect. In fact, they're filled with flaws. So it's really all about, like I say, I think it's about being timely as opposed to the right time to tweet. So the perfect example is if you want to tweet about what's happening today, tweet about it today as you're hearing the speech, not necessarily next week. But then on the flip side, if you're writing an article about what's happening today next week, then you're going to want to tweet about it. So it's not a perfect science. There's right-ish times for, not to be totally vague. One more?
If you're a mission, say a consulate or an embassy with several different areas, business areas, and several different target audiences, everything from export to investment to public diplomacy, culture, you want to reach press, you want to reach certain sectors, how do you communicate that broadly and at the same time be authentic and be engaging in the role you have?
Well, I think it depends on the volume of content that you have. Now, if you said, you're talking about the business world, you're talking about press, you're talking about your constituencies, and you're talking about a few other groups, you actually may want to look at different Twitter handles. You'll see a lot of, and you can borrow from the banking world. Bank of America is actually very good at this. They have one Twitter handle that is Bank of America News. and that's all about breaking news and important things to reach journalists. They have one that's about community, and that's all about their philanthropic and corporate social responsibility efforts. They have another one that's related to consumer banking, another one that's related to careers. Now, when we say that and say, okay, you're going to have multiple Twitter handles, it's not that much of a lift, because if you were going to tweet those 20 tweets out per day to different audiences on one handle, it's just a matter of switching accounts and going to others. So really looking at the volume, I would say, would dictate should it be on one handle or not. Now, on the flip side, thinking about the sort of life cycle of a tweet, it's likely you're not going to overwhelm your audience. I mean, maybe unless you go towards some of those accounts I talked about that are doing 78 or so tweets. But really to be in relevant conversations and have sort of the people that you're trying to reach respond to you, retweet you, mention you, it might make sense to look at having multiple accounts. Okay. So one question that came in from Twitter, and this is, how should someone handle tweeting something that they regret? I think I would liken that to the same thing of, how would you handle saying something you regret? And if this question, which I imagine is coming, the media picks it up, it goes out in the news. I mean, I think it's the same piece. You're prepared, you have the right statement out there. If you do regret that, sort of be human. You're talking to sort of a very, very social world. There's nothing wrong with apologizing.
Oh, okay. First time at the UN, hi. So in that particular case where you regret tweeting something, you wouldn't recommend deleting a tweet?
I mean, the example that I gave about the American football team, because what was put out there was derogatory and racist and horrible, I would say delete that. In most cases, if it's out there, it's out there. Now, somebody goes through their feed, they don't necessarily want someone to see that makes sense, but if you say something to the point where, you're out there and you regret it and you think, the media is going to pick it up, whatever else, it's there regardless, and I think it's you already own it, so there's no point in deleting it. I think there's one more back here, and then
Hi, good morning. First of all, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. One of the questions, it's actually a two-part question. So if you're just starting out with a Twitter handle, I would like to know, first of all, how many, if there's a requested or let's say recommended amount of tweets that we should make per day, and how many times per week would it be recommended for us to start up?
I think a simple average is to do between 4 and 6 a day, and average that over the course of a week. It really all depends. We've actually advised some clients when there is an event like this. So there were, at least what was it, about 5,000 companies at that one event. And what we decided was we wanted the company, from a branding standpoint, to be visible on the hashtag during the event. So we said, we had just launched, let's make it so that every 10th tweet is from this specific company. Now, that's not something I would say to do on an ongoing basis, but as you're launching, that's a really good way to get yourself out there and, get in touch with some followers.
Now, the question is, that's about Twitter. What's the next big thing?
That's a great question. And I would like it if my financial person could tell me that as well. What we're seeing are interesting. Twitter is really short form, and we joke. I read an article in The Atlantic, and it was called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And it was written in 2007, and it was talking about how, it was the history of how different inventions and innovations have sort of changed people's cognitive nature. And so the first example was, think of a father and son. The father was born before a clock was invented, and the son was born after. So the father would have to use his brain power to look at the son to tell time, and the son would say, okay, it's 12:30. So there's a different set of, cognitive energy spent there. And this was talking about Google in 2007 and how it was changing the way that people were doing academic research. So I remember when I was in university, I would sit in the library with a stack of books and highlighters and Post-it notes, and I would actually highlight the books in the library, but don't tell my school. And that was the way I did it, and I would actually sit and write it. Some of the people who work for me, who were in school very recently, what have they done? They've gone on Google, they've searched a subject, they've read the first sentence of the article and said, no, this isn't good. They've clicked back and forth and back and forth. And that's their attention span. This article was actually written before Twitter, so what's the next step? Twitter is now, you're getting a point out in 140 characters and so digestible. And you think, okay, it can only get so short form. There's now a company called Yo. And Yo sends you a message and it says Yo. And that's how you communicate. And it's yo and a link. And so you're seeing companies, you're seeing organizations, this and that. They're not even describing what it is. You just sign up to get updates and it says, yo, link, click here. So I think the next big thing is something that's going to get even more short form, but somehow even more rich. Yep.
First of all, thank you so much. I have a question as a mission tweeting at the UN. There are a lot of speeches that take place, a lot. And many times we will be live tweeting them. And my question is, sometimes there will be more than 4 tweets coming out of that speech, sometimes 10. And how do you make sure that each tweet, each line gets the maximum engagement?
There is no easy answer with that. I think that's an instance where I talked about, really helping this one company become very visible. I think it's just that. You want to be visible. So I wouldn't look at it as each tweet getting the amount of engagement, but overall, did you get the amount of engagement by the amount of tweets that you sent? Because a speech is a lot more than 140 characters, different points are. Yeah. Okay.
Do you recommend retweeting the same tweet just to get more visibility?
Yes and no. For the most part, retweeting is, and I don't mean this negatively, it's sort of a lazy form of tweeting. Now, granted, you're dealing with 140 characters, but I would always recommend doing a mention or a quote so you can put your own spin on it, especially if there is a link to it. So, so-and-so spoke about X, you mentioned the person's name and you put a link in versus just a simple retweet. Now, it's not to say that retweets are bad. I just think find a balance between tweeting original content or content that has a point of view and retweets.
Thanks. I meant more, I should have been more clear. Sending out your tweets multiple times. Do you recommend that?
I wouldn't recommend that as a full practice. Again, I think it's the same thing. You can send things multiple times just because of the life cycle, but you want to make sure that you have other content in between there, because most people don't follow a Twitter handle by clicking on their page and reading their profile, but some do. And so if somebody goes to your profile and they see the same tweet 20 times, they're going to say, why am I following this? I got what they have to say.
Well, I have to admit I'm a social media newbie, so I maybe ask stupid questions here, and sorry if I ask a question which maybe has already been answered because I came late. I just want to see what's the relationship between Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and other media for communication purposes, as a mission, as a diplomat. I know, of course, what the different contents are, but are there do's and don'ts, how to use each of these media best for official purposes, or is Instagram, for instance, not a medium you could use for official purposes?
So you can actually use them each for their own purpose. Twitter and Instagram go incredibly well together because you take a picture and then you send a tweet linking to the picture. Facebook is a bit more long form, so you can actually say a bit more. Now, if you're trying to get attention to something where you're trying to get engagement on Facebook, you can tweet and push someone there. So the way I'd almost look at it is look at Twitter as sort of your real-time content feed, and then look at Facebook in a lot of ways as a magazine. Things are going to have a lot longer shelf life on Facebook than they are on Twitter. So Twitter is, in the end, it's something to attract people and to get people somewhere else or to get people to engage, where Facebook, you can really create something that can last for 2 or 3 weeks if you're trying to start a discussion. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I think this gentleman has, I'm sorry. Absolutely. I mean, the joke I always make is people love to look at pretty pictures and shiny things, but in reality they do. And it definitely, a line of text with a picture is much better than a line of text. Yeah. So I think we can take one more. One gentleman.
Thank you. I got a question that I also posted on Twitter, which is maybe a bit, I'll try to make it simple. Do you think that diplomats are actually ready for the digital world? I mean, as a diplomat, I was given, my permanent representative gave me the task to develop social media at my mission, the mission of Italy, by the way. And my impression is that in my category, we are still looking backwards comparing to other categories. For example, our leaders, politicians, who are much more used than us to communicate, they are much more ready to jump into this. Diplomacy, well, we're going there, we're getting there, but my impression is that we are still slow. What do you think?
I mean, I think I think it depends on the level of pressure and the level of importance of the actual diplomacy you're conducting. I think that's first and foremost. You know, Twitter is never going to replace human interaction. So it's a great way to communicate, and I think more so, just like the media, it's a great way to show communication, but it will never substitute for, you know, things that are actually happening of one-to-one and face-to-face interactions. I can give you one example before I close. We actually saw at the World Economic Forum last year a conversation between the president of Iran and Shimon Peres from Israel going back and forth. And you can tell in a lot of ways that neither one of them were actually tweeting. It was their age just pushing out rhetoric. And so what did that show? Okay, we're sort of talking, but that doesn't actually replace, you know, getting those two people to the table to actually speak. So again, it's sort of a way to show things, but not necessarily a way to actually actively make a difference. Okay. Thank you very much. Really appreciate you having me today.